Your heart is pounding right now because your spirit recognizes this message was destined for you. There are only 72 hours before the final transfer of your ordained wealth is locked by heaven's decree. But a friend you consider a brother is secretly sabotaging every open door behind your back. If you ignore this now, you will lose the $275,000 manifestation meant to free your bloodline and remain blind to the divine destiny written for you before time began. Do not skip this. Now declare your yes. Type, "I claim my destiny" in the comments below. My beloved, beloved child, Archangel Michael speaks. I stand before the throne, and heaven itself has commanded me to descend with this urgent decree for your ears only. Your spirit has been crying out for answers, and the Father has heard you. The anxiety you feel, the tightness in your chest as you listen, is not fear. It is your eternal spirit recognizing the frequency of a truth you were born to receive. You have always felt different, my beloved. You have always felt a quiet knowing that you were meant for more, that your struggles were not in vain, that a great purpose was woven into your very DNA. Heaven confirms this. Your intuition was not wrong. There is a sum of money, a specific financial breakthrough of $275,000 that has been ordained for you. It is not a lottery. It is not luck. It is a divine transfer. A release of resources meant to fund the mission you agreed to before you took your first breath. This wealth is to break generational chains of lack and to establish a legacy of abundance for your bloodline. But listen to me now, and listen with every fiber of your being. There are only 72 hours before the spiritual window for this transfer begins to close. This is a non-negotiable celestial deadline, 72 hours. And there is a reason you have not yet seen this manifestation. A hidden force is working against you. The Father has permitted me to reveal this to you because your obedience has been noted. The person you confide in, the one you call a friend, the one you have broken bread with and trusted with your dreams, is actively blocking your blessing. This is the shocking revelation, both a warning and a blessing. You have felt a strange distance from them lately. You have noticed their enthusiasm for your success feels forced, hollow. Heaven is watching, and I tell you, your discernment is correct. They are not who they pretend to be. You must understand the authority from which I speak. I, Michael, the Archangel, the Prince of the heavenly armies, stand on the authority of the Most High God. This message is not a suggestion. It is a divine command. God specifically chose you for this breakthrough because of your resilience. Your past struggles, the financial lack, the betrayals you've already endured, the loneliness you felt even in a crowd, were all a preparation for this moment. You were being tested, strengthened, and forged in the fire of adversity to be able to steward this blessing with humility and power. Do not skip this. Your destiny hangs in the balance of the next 72 hours. You must heed every word I say. The angels confirm this revelation. You will understand why as we continue. Stay with this message. My beloved, I see the tears welling in your eyes. I feel the conflict in your heart. Part of you wants to reject this, to defend the friend you love. This is your compassionate spirit, and it is a credit to you. But another, deeper part of you, the part that has always wondered why good opportunities mysteriously fall apart, why promises made to you are never kept, knows this is the truth you have been searching for. That strange feeling you had about the loan that was suddenly denied, the job promotion that went to someone less qualified, the business deal that collapsed at the last minute for no logical reason. Your intuition was not wrong. Heaven is watching and has recorded every single one of these events, and in each case, the fingerprints of this trusted friend are there. They did not cause it directly, my child. Their role is more subtle, more spiritual, and therefore more dangerous. They engage in what you would call prayer, but it is not light they are invoking. It is an energy of containment, of limitation, dressed in the language of concern. When you share your excitement about a new possibility, they respond with wise words of caution that carry the hidden frequency of doubt. Are you sure you can handle that? Maybe you should wait, that seems risky. They speak lack over you while pretending to protect you. This is why your obedience is the key that unlocks the vault of heaven. Your financial breakthrough is directly tied to your spiritual obedience to break this unholy alliance. The money is there. The accounts are poised. The divine connections have been arranged. But a leash of misplaced loyalty ties your hands behind your back. This person, my beloved, sees your light and feels a deep hidden insecurity that they have never confronted. Your rise feels like a judgment on their own stagnation. And so, unconsciously for them, but very consciously in the spirit realm, they have chosen to hold you back to keep you at their level. You've always wondered why, after spending time with this person, you feel drained, doubtful, and anxious instead of uplifted. Now you know. Heaven says your intuition was not wrong. There are now 71 hours remaining. The clock is moving, my child. Every second you spend in disbelief is a second your adversary uses to reinforce the barriers around your life. Do not skip this. The one with the strongest spirit gets the hardest revelation because they are the only one strong enough to bear it and act on it. You are that one. Now I must expose the specific damning evidence. Heaven has permitted this to remove all doubt from your heart. 3 days ago, you had a conversation with this person. You mentioned a specific sum you were believing for, $15,000, to clear a debt that has been weighing on your spirit. Do you remember? You shared that sacred hope with them. And do you remember their response? They said, "I'll agree with you in prayer." But later that night, in their private moments, different words left their mouth. They said, "They don't need that kind of pressure. It's better if that doesn't happen right now." And they decreed and declared no over the very thing you believed God for. Your hands are trembling because you remember this. You remember the subtle shift in the room. You felt it, but you dismissed it. That was the spiritual sabotage. That single act reinforced the barrier. This is how it works, my beloved. They are a portal of opposition. The $275,000 is not being held back by God. It is being filtered out by the negative declarations of someone you have given spiritual authority in your life. I will be even more specific. The color blue is significant here. Either they drive a blue vehicle, or their home has blue door, or they often wear a blue jacket. This is a signpost from heaven to confirm their identity to you beyond any doubt. Think, see it in your mind's eye. You know now who I am speaking of. The feeling of unease you get when you see that color in the context of this person is your spirit screaming the truth at you. This is the emotional peak of this revelation. It is painful. It feels like a betrayal, and it is. But it is also your liberation. Knowing the truth is what sets you free. This is why you must stay until the end. At the 24-minute mark, I will reveal the first of 3 hidden secrets about this person's past that directly connect to your bloodline. Secrets that will make everything painfully and perfectly clear. You cannot afford to miss that. The deadline, my child. We are now at 70 hours remaining. 70 hours to make the spiritual shift that will open the floodgates. Do not skip this. Your financial obedience, which is to sever this toxic spiritual tie, is the only requirement left on your end. The money is already yours in the spirit. It must now manifest in the natural. Heaven is watching your every move. You wish to know why. Why would someone you trust do this? Their motivation is not pure evil, my beloved. It is a deep, festering wound of jealousy that they themselves do not fully understand. 7 years ago, you both experienced a similar setback, a financial loss, a failed venture. But where you turned to God in your pain and began the slow, obedient climb back, they turned inward. They nurtured a root of bitterness. They began to believe that if they could not have a breakthrough, then no one in their immediate circle should. especially not you, because your success would prove that their failure was a choice, not a destiny. The divine realm discovered this through your prayers. Every time you prayed for them, which you have done consistently, your prayers ascended like incense, but they hit a ceiling of resistance around their life and bounced back to the heavenly courts as evidence. The angels assigned to you documented this. The obstruction was noted. God specifically chose you to be the one to break this cycle, not just for you, but for them as well. Your liberation is the key to their eventual salvation, though they will fight it tooth and nail. Now here are your instructions. You must not confront them in anger. That is not the way of heaven. The obedience required is spiritual first. In the next 70 hours, you must do the following. First, you must revoke their spiritual authority over your life. You must say out loud, "In the name of the highest authority, I revoke and dissolve every assignment of lack, limitation, and sabotage spoken over my life and my finances, whether knowingly or unknowingly. I cancel every negative word and decree divine alignment and abundance." You must do this. Second, you must create a spiritual boundary. This does not mean you must end the friendship today in the physical realm, though that may become necessary. It means you must immediately stop sharing any details of your dreams, your finances, or your hopes with this person. Your vision is sacred. Protect it. When they ask, you simply say, "I'm trusting God with my path." You must be obedient in this. The clock is ticking. 69 hours now remain. This is your divine assignment. Your financial breakthrough is waiting on your spiritual obedience. This is the second call to ensure you are following this revelation. Do not skip this. The blessings of the righteous are never delayed without cause. The cause has now been revealed. The solution is now in your hands. Heaven is watching to see what you will do with this information. What happens if you ignore this warning, my beloved? The consequences are severe and heartbreaking. If you choose sentimentality over obedience, the $275,000 will be diverted. It will not vanish. According to divine law, it must be released, but it will go to the backup candidate, a distant relative of yours who has also been praying, but with a pure and obedient heart. They will receive the manifestation meant for you. They will fund the mission you were supposed to lead. They will break the generational curses in their family that mirror your own, and you will be left wondering what happened, still struggling, still bound, and forever wondering, what if? But that is not your destiny. The rewards of heeding this warning are beyond your grandest dreams. The $275,000 is merely the key. It will unlock a door to a realm of abundance you cannot currently fathom. It will come through unexpected channels. A legal settlement you forgot about, a mistaken overpayment that is legally yours to keep, a divine idea that leads to a windfall profit. It will happen suddenly and it will be undeniable. I strengthen this personal validation now. You have always been the one people could rely on. You have always been the one to forgive, to show up, to give your last. You have wondered if anyone sees your sacrifice. Heaven sees it. God specifically chose you because of your faithful heart in the midst of lack. Your character has been certified in the fires of adversity. The enemy targeted you with this saboteur because your light is so potent, so necessary for the coming shift. Your feeling of being different is because you are a spiritual pioneer, a generational curse breaker, and the financial abundance is simply the tool you need to build the new world you are destined to create. You have 68 hours. 68 hours to choose your destiny. Will you choose the comfort of a familiar chains or the courageous uncertainty of freedom? The one with the strongest spirit gets the hardest revelation because they are the only one who can handle the truth and still choose love. But choosing love for yourself means choosing obedience to God above loyalty to man. Do not skip this. Your entire life has been a preparation for this single decision. Why you? This is the question burning in your soul. Why were you chosen for this difficult path and this magnificent blessing? Let me reveal the divine plan behind your struggles. Your bloodline, for 7 generations, has been under a pledge of poverty. An ancestor made a vow of perpetual lack in exchange for a short-term gain. This vow has bound your family line, but you, my beloved, you were the 7th generation heir. In your 7th year of significant spiritual seeking, which was last year, you broke that curse through your sincere prayers, even though you didn't know what you were doing. Your obedience activated a celestial clause. The financial breakthrough of $275,000 is not a gift. It is a return. It is the compounded interest on every blessing, every opportunity, every resource that was stolen from your bloodline for 7 generations. It is back pay from heaven. The enemy, knowing the curse was broken, sent a final powerful stronghold to try and block the transfer. A friend operating under the old familiar spirit of lack that your family was so accustomed to. This is why it felt familiar. This is why you tolerated it. You were conditioned to lack, to betrayal, to things falling apart. Heaven is watching and celebrating because you are breaking the cycle. You have always wondered why you felt a connection to the number 7. Now you know. It is your number of completion and vindication. The 72-hour deadline is a divine alignment with this generational mathematics. 72 is 7 multiplied by the number of grace. This is a grace period to claim what is rightfully yours. This is the 2nd emotional peak. Feel the weight of this. Your entire life's journey, every odd and end, every moment of pain, is now making sense. It was all leading to this crossroads. The friend is merely a player in a much larger drama, and their role is about to end. Your hands are trembling because your spirit is remembering the vow it made before you were born to be the one who ends this. You said yes to this. You agreed to this difficult path because you knew the glory on the other side would be worth it. Remember now. 68 hours remain, but now you understand the cosmic significance behind them. This is not a random countdown. It is the final countdown of a 7-generation curse. Do not skip this. The angels are on the edge of their seats, waiting to see if the heir will claim their throne. Now I reveal the full, specific manifestation. The $275,000 will not come as one lump sum from a single source. That would overwhelm you. It will arrive in 3 distinct waves, each confirming the next. Within 7 days of your spiritual obedience to revoke the authority of this saboteur, you will receive a first payment of $47,500. This will come from a forgotten asset, an old account, or a rebate you did not expect. It will be exactly this amount. This is the sign that the transfer has initiated. The second wave, $103,000, will arrive before the next full moon. It will come through a business or creative idea you will have in a dream you will have immediately after this financial separation. Write the dream down. Act on it without doubt. This is the substance of your faith. The final wave, $124,500, will come as a direct deposit or a physical check delivered to your hand from a source you currently perceive as an adversary. It will be a reconciliation and a restitution. The exact total is $275,000. This is the divine logistics. The money is real, it is tangible. It is already moving in the spirit realm toward you, but the pipeline is clogged by the spiritual interference of one person. Your obedience is the plumber that clears the pipe. It is that simple. Heaven is not complicated. The specific nature of your calling is also now revealed. This money is to fund a sanctuary, not necessarily a church, my beloved, but a safe haven. It could be a home property turned into a refuge for those who are broken, a business that employs and empowers the overlooked, or a creative studio that produces art that heals nations. You have held this dream in your heart since you were a child, but buried it because it seemed impossible. Heaven says it is your mandate. The blueprints are in your spirit. The finances are now released for it. You have 67 hours. 67 hours to say yes to your destiny and no to the spirit of lack. Every minute you wait, the backup candidate's file grows brighter. Do not let your inheritance be given to another. You have suffered too long for it. You have been too faithful to lose it now. Do not skip this. Heaven is watching your next move. This is the moment of empowerment. The breaking of generational curses is now. I, Archangel Michael, place my sword of light over your life. I sever every cord of lack, every tie of betrayal, every vow of poverty spoken over your bloodline. I cut you free from the influence of this saboteur. I decree the transfer of wealth is activated, but you must agree. You must speak it. Say after me out loud, I receive my liberation. I accept my divine inheritance. I revoke all alien authority. I decree that the $275,000 is mine, and it comes to me now without delay. In the name of the highest power, I am the breaker of curses. I am the heir of abundance. I am chosen. This is your spiritual act of obedience. This is you signing the receipt for your blessing. This declaration made in faith shatters the final barriers. The angels assigned to finance are now released to orchestrate the manifestation. They have been waiting for your command. You have the authority. Use it. This is the final and most direct call. You must stay connected to this frequency of truth. The enemy will immediately try to make you doubt this message. He will send thoughts like, "This is nonsense," or "You're being paranoid about your friend." Those are his lies. Fight them with the truth you have received here. Play this message again. Let it cement in your spirit. Your financial breakthrough is tied to your spiritual obedience. You have 66 hours. The countdown is real. The blessing is real. The threat is real. But you are more than a conqueror. Do not skip this. Claim your destiny now. My beloved child, hear my final words. This message was sealed for you before the foundations of the world. You are eternally loved, eternally chosen, and eternally protected. I, Michael, and my legion of angels are now forming a shield of fire around you. No weapon formed against you shall prosper. Every tongue that rises against you, you shall condemn. This is your heritage. You will be vindicated. The friend who sabotaged you will be exposed without you lifting a finger. They will confess their actions in time, and you will be able to forgive from a place of power and pity, not pain. You are free. Now go in power, go in grace, go in the absolute knowing that you are heaven's child and your time of abundance has come. The 72-hour clock is ticking. 66 hours remain. Obey. Activate your faith. Speak the word. Your destiny is calling. Answer it. Amen.